بعد از عمری مجاهدت حسینی و دائمی و خستگی ناپذیر روح بلند و ملکوتی.
All right, let's get straight to the point. While much of the world was enjoying a quiet weekend, the United States and Israel reportedly launched a large-scale military operation targeting strategic sites inside Iran. The strikes were said to hit military infrastructure, command centers, and, most critically, the highest levels of leadership. Tehran responded immediately. Missiles and drones were launched toward targets in Israel and toward U.S. and allied bases across the Gulf, including Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE. Iranian officials framed the attacks as direct retaliation for earlier airstrikes. But the most explosive development was this. Reports that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, had been killed in a coordinated U.S.-Israeli strike. If true, this would not simply mark another escalation. It would represent a full-scale decapitation strategy, an attempt to fracture the political and religious core of the Islamic Republic and disrupt its command structure at the highest level. President Donald Trump publicly announced Khamenei's death and stated that several senior commanders were also eliminated. Iran later acknowledged significant losses and declared national mourning, a signal that this was far more than a tactical setback. The implications are enormous. The end of a decades-long leadership era, the risk of succession struggles, the potential for broader regional escalation, and immediate turbulence across global energy markets. But to truly understand what is unfolding, we need to look beyond the battlefield. This conflict is not fundamentally about nuclear rhetoric or public statements regarding regional militias. It is embedded in the architecture of the global economic order. At the center of that architecture lies the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow maritime choke point through which a substantial portion of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas flows every day. Even the threat of disruption in this corridor can send shockwaves through energy markets, pushing oil prices higher, reigniting inflationary pressure, and forcing central banks into difficult policy decisions. For the United States, already managing high public debt, inflation sensitivity, and domestic political strain, an oil shock represents systemic risk. Markets have already shown signs of unease, oil climbing, gold surging, capital rotating into safe haven assets. These are not random movements. They are signals of strategic uncertainty. Iran's importance, therefore, is not only military, it is geographic. It sits near the pressure point of global energy supply and, by extension, near the foundation of the financial system that underpins American power. This leads us to the often understated dimension of the petrodollar system. For decades, most international oil transactions have been priced and settled in U.S. dollars. That arrangement reinforced global demand for dollar reserves and helped cement the dollar's status as the world's dominant reserve currency. Countries that require energy must hold dollars. That sustained demand supports America's ability to finance its vast public debt through dollar-denominated treasury bonds. If major energy producers increasingly shift toward alternative currencies or non-dollar settlement mechanisms, structural demand for the dollar could weaken. A weaker demand base could translate into higher borrowing costs for the United States and greater strain on federal finances. From Washington's perspective, any meaningful erosion of dollar-based energy trade carries long-term strategic consequences. When Iran explores mechanisms that reduce reliance on the dollar, it is not merely an economic adjustment, it can be perceived as a challenge to the financial foundation of U.S. global influence. At the same time, Iran's internal political structure complicates any path toward compromise. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the state has been built around ideological resistance to Western influence. This narrative forms the backbone of regime legitimacy. In systems where power and ideology are tightly fused, major concessions on nuclear policy, missile development, or relations with the United States are not simple policy recalibrations. They carry existential implications. Retreat too far, and internal cohesion risks fracture. Continue escalation, and economic sanctions and military pressure intensify. That is the strategic dilemma Tehran faces. From Washington's vantage point, targeting the supreme leader, if that indeed occurred, was not only a military calculation, but a symbolic one. In Iran's political architecture, the supreme leader represents the central axis of authority. Nuclear doctrine, missile strategy, and regional proxy networks ultimately converge at that apex. Striking at that level sends a deterrent message. Escalation is possible, and no tier of leadership is beyond reach. Making such an action public amplifies the psychological dimension. It transforms a military strike into strategic signaling. Ultimately, U.S. foreign policy decisions, and despite public language about stability, international norms, or regional security, tend to revolve around a pragmatic core: protecting national interests, securing alliances, safeguarding energy flows, and maintaining economic dominance. When Washington perceives those pillars as threatened, its response often reflects power projection. What we are witnessing is not merely another regional confrontation. It is the intersection of military strategy, ideological rigidity, energy leverage, and financial architecture. And history offers a consistent lesson. Major powers do not act primarily for abstract global peace. They act first to preserve their own security, influence, and strategic position in an increasingly unstable world order.